Hello, beautiful community. Welcome to a Vlad Reacts episode where we watch a little bit of a clip and react on here on the chat channel. So tuck yourselves in. It's going to be probably light, but maybe also serious, right? Because we take discourse about Putin, about Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, Europe's security very seriously. But it's also okay to be lighthearted when things get silly. I'm often asked to, and I never do, react to Times Radio episodes on how Putin has 4 seconds left on Earth. And some of the very best content on Russia is actually on YouTube, on Times Radio. You could argue some of the worst is there too. And of course, the way the YouTube channel has grown for them is through thumbnails about Putin's imminent demise. And I sometimes joke with people who go on there that the talk's really good. And Mark Galeotti often has this. He goes on and he says, well, I don't know, the regime is not transparent and it looks stable as far as we can tell. And then the headline, the thumbnail is, Putin has 3.4 seconds left on Earth. Breaking news. And there is an... And I should have got my oxygen tank for this section. There's another industry now which doesn't say Putin's time is numbered, days are numbered, but actually says that Putin is no longer with us, and it's actually his doubles running the show. That's a sort of a two-step remove. New discourse industry that we have. So let's react a little bit. So this is going to be a reaction to a military voice, Colonel, ex-British military Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. And the thumbnail is, Putin's days are numbered. Putin's days are numbered as rumblings of assassination attempts intensify. Okay, let's listen to it. I love ex-military voices, and actually, to be serious, one of the things that's historically happened, funnily enough, in the British press, I'm not sure it's true anymore, but if you go back sort of 10 years, it's often the case that the right-wing press is better on military stuff because they're just so much more networked with ex-generals, important military folks. So they've often been much more on top of military stuff. Telegraph has been, and at times has been over the years. I don't think that's necessarily true now anymore. Let's do this and then see how we go. When you listen to classical music, actually, what is this thing called? Edition XS. If you pair it with a good amp DAC, it's really good, budget-friendly, fairly neutral stuff for classical music. So it's a good minimal effective dose setup. These funny headphones. Okay, let's roll.
Let's get into this limousine exploding, Hamish. Caught fire in Moscow at the same time that Putin had been showing signs of paranoia. He had his own guards patted down for weapons. So do you think Putin is being targeted within Russia?
There are rumblings, rumors that people in a circle are losing patience with Putin, and the way that the Russian leadership works, it is all pretty unpleasant and cynical, and Putin has been the biggest dog in this fight in the Kremlin for the last 25 years.
So let me stop this. I watched some of the rest of this interview, and a lot of the parts of it are good. There's one of the things we shouldn't do on the internet is cut people out, like 32 seconds of them, and then sort of giggle at that. So we're not going to do that now, and we're also going to emphasize the principle that you've got to understand what you're losing when you do that. Because we have this tendency to do this. It actually undermines our discourse. It actually undermines our capacity to argue against our opponents when we clip our opponents into 31-second clips and then giggle at them. An empathetic reconstruction of another position, whether it's stupid or frivolous or entrepreneurial, is always a precondition for a kind of sustained seriousness in your argument back.
but there are indications that that he might not be. There might be others. This explosion, it's not his purse. He wasn't anywhere near it, but it's a sort of demonstration of what might happen. I think the second element to this is the babushkas, who are
Okay, well, let's react to the first bit straight away. One of the most sort of electrifyingly charismatic voices often on YouTube is Peter Zion. And it's actually a bit unfair to talk about Peter's sort of factual or name-related slips, because I think there's a bit of ADHD driving it. I'm sometimes not sure whether it's correct to say this, but it's often understandable. So I'm somebody who actually is genuinely open to apocalyptic factual slips being okay. I'm not somebody who likes to play gotcha. But at the same time, you often can get the impression that there are particular things people talk about that they don't know anything about. So when Hamish talks about there being indications that there could be a challenge to Putin, he doesn't have any. Not only does he not have any, he wouldn't even know how to go about discovering if they were there. There are some people in the world who do. It's even harder for them because actually before the war, during the public health crisis, Putin's isolation made it really hard for people who previously used to be able to reach into Putin's circle and figure out who's saying what and what's going on. So taking that temperature is genuinely harder. But quite frankly, I don't think Hamish knows that there are such indications, or what it would even mean for him to learn that they are there. Nor does he know, in my view, how the regime is structured, what the motivations of each individual actor in it are, what the psychological profile of each of the actors are, and how they relate to an adequate sociology of Russian society, which would require a conversation about the radical depoliticization of Russian society, the extraordinary nature of the selection process. How do these people end up around Putin? What qualities are selected for? And once you give a proper account of that, you're going to end up with a very pessimistic picture of capacity to challenge, because these are some of the most loyal and, if you like, spectacularly unethical folks who are also bestowed with spectacular passivity, folks in Putin's regime, such that what you really need to understand is that there is never going to be a movement by this individual or that individual. What's going to happen is that there's going to be typically a change in a social dynamic of a certain kind, and then actors will begin to move. So it's going to be that a historical moment changes, and then actors begin to move, rather than it being particular actors because of certain profiles they have changing the historical moment. But here, all I would really say is it's transparent. Hamish wouldn't know. And I don't want to be mean and say therefore he shouldn't talk about it. No, I'm not telling him off like a 5-year-old, but basically, no, he has no clue. And I mean, let me reach for this. If we get, also Peter Zion on, so there's an amazing green foliage behind me. So, Peter, what do you think about, quite a few months ago, sort of Belousov coming in to replace Shoigu, that change in the Putin regime? How do you assess it? Well, this is Peter, obviously. Yeah, what you've got to understand about Putin's previous inner circle, you're talking about people like Medvedev, Sechin, Chernomyrdin, Chernenko, Shevchenko, Tsar Nicholas II, is that they're the most incompetent people on earth, but the people they've been replaced with are just as incompetent, but maybe ever so slightly less incompetent. So these people also have no idea what they're doing. You're really talking about people like Lenin, Brezhnev, Tsar Nicholas II, Alexander the Third. So and so no, that you don't know anything about that regime. You don't know anything about its internal dynamics. Let's listen on.
Who are the mothers of Russia. Now, when 17,000 Russian soldiers died in Afghanistan, they marched on the Kremlin in 1984 and made the Kremlin retreat in defeat from Afghanistan. Now, many people have wondered why, they haven't been as vocal this time. And I understand it from Russian experts that the situation is actually fairly straightforward. Although there are nearly 1 million casualties, Russian casualties, the view of the rank and file in Russia, the Russian mothers, the babushkas, is that a lot of those soldiers are prisoners, as we know, but also their people are making a fast buck. And Russian soldiers are paid a fortune in Russia, way above the sort of living national wage, really bribed to go to the front line. But when they die, their families are not paid compensation. And this is beginning to rise the mothers of Russia who are creating discontent. So there are a number of pressures, I think, on Putin in particular.
No, the mothers of Russia are not rising or creating discontent. And I don't think Hamish would know how to analyze Russian society, sorry. So again, he doesn't have the answer. He doesn't even know what it would mean to discover it. But the bit before is excellent, actually. He's absolutely right that there's a kind of a business transaction psychology to contract soldiers. And the way that psychology works is that there is a sense of, you don't want to push this thesis too far, but there's a sense of a kind of internal colonization in Russia. We saw this a bit in Kursk. You almost got the feeling that you could imagine some Russians not even caring whether they were ruled by Russia or Ukraine. So there is a sense of a regime in the Kremlin that is an alien force. And then that alien force proposes a business deal for you, and you take it up because it's personally advantageous. So this is very much imperialism and neoliberalism tied. You're seeing elements of that in the Trump administration, right? Various sort of causal interpenetrations between commitment to the market and colonization type discourse. So what happens when your neighbor Ivan makes a business transaction with this alien force in the Kremlin is that as his neighbor, you feel Ivan is going to bear the consequences of this business deal working out badly. And it's up to Ivan to weigh up the cash, which normally would mean extinguishing very big debts. So the Russians are very much indebted as a population. So Ivan can weigh that up for himself and for his family versus the negative consequences, which are impacts on his body and impacts on his life, survival. So if that equation, that business transaction works out against Ivan, that's not my fault. It's Ivan's fault. It has nothing to do with me as Ivan's neighbor. You see the radical depoliticization here. That's what's typically primary in sort of mid-sized Russian towns, small Russian towns, psychologically on the ground, and how these contract soldiers are thought of. So it's very difficult to jump out of that and then begin thinking about the purposes of the war and why it might be a disaster, not just because it's a brutal attack on an innocent neighbor, but because it's a kind of long-distance self-immolation that the Russian government is imposing on the country, on Russia. So that's fairly reasonable. Let's go on.
On Putin in particular, around the Kremlin and around people realizing actually the folly of what's happened, and actually 1 million casualties is not worth it, because this is not a patriotic war for the majority of Russians. So yeah, there
not
are
bad. Okay,
there
this
are
is not bad.
murmurings, which is why I think, as we mentioned earlier in this video, that the tide might be turning in a number
No, it
of
isn't.
ways.
It really isn't turning
And
anywhere, Hamish.
in warfare, it's generally not one thing that changes or happens that creates a defeat or victory. But if several things come together, then they can create the momentum. And at the moment, I should think Putin is a lot less content than he was 6 weeks ago or even a few months ago.
And then we had those comments from President Zelensky, Hamish, saying that he does think that Putin will die soon. And on the note of these troops, numerous guests
Let's do this.
on my show have said that if signs start to point to Russia losing the war, not being able to keep up the war, then he will be targeted by his own Russians who rely on this income from being soldiers. As you said, they get paid more than the minimum wage. So troops do rely on being troops. And if they start to see that Putin is losing the war, that they will start targeting him themselves.
Well, I think, as you said, there is a certain amount of paranoia coming out of Putin's camp at the moment. There will always be people. It's the way that the Russian state has always worked. You have one dictator, but there'll be people lining up to take over, as there always have been. Really since the
No, people are not lining up to take over, not just because that's not true, and Hamish would know about how to discover whether it's true if it were, but that's just not how it works. Social conditions change first, then agents, often agents who you wouldn't have thought as being the agents to take initiative, begin taking initiative. It works that way around. I'm repeating myself, but it's very important. The situation changes, actors begin to move.
Russian Federation, Russian Revolution back at the beginning of last century. So one would expect that. And,
And so what would be these social factors that change? It would need to be a combination, often of a kind of synergistic kind between a crack in the regime and bottom-up mobilization of a certain kind, probably assisted by political leadership. But don't imagine political leadership of a liberal democratic kind. You witness what leadership might come onto the scene, for instance, with Mr. Prigozhin's mutiny.
One would expect that. And, failure is not something, doesn't end well for tyrants who fail, because there'll be somebody else to take them up. So, there are lots of things happening at the moment. And, everything seemed to be going well for Putin, especially with his negotiations with Trump. But things are changing. And as soon as you say, the perspective that Putin is losing, his days are numbered. And
Hamish, Putin's days are numbered. Hamish, do you mean this? Do you really want me to believe that you mean this? I don't believe you mean this. And I don't believe you can discover the relevant knowledge and make the relevant interpretations to make that judgment. But I think you've got wonderful expertise elsewhere. But this is not you. Sorry.
Zelensky's comments that Putin will soon be dead are, you can probably read into them whatever you like. But again, I think it would be naive for people to think that there are not Ukraine agents and other agents who are conducting
that's not remotely what Zelensky means or has in mind when he talks about Putin's days being numbered. I'll tell you what Zelensky means.
Espionage and operations against the Russian state. That is the way these things work. So whether somebody, a Russian or others, is trying to eliminate Putin, who knows? But it wouldn't be surprising.
Okay, so let's read a snippetification from Mark Galeotti about this sort of thing, because Mark, I think, has come out recently and made a comment on this. And I've got his piece here, which I'll link up below. And he quotes Mr. Zelensky saying, Putin will not be with us soon, that's a fact, and it'll be all over. I'm younger than Putin, put your bets on me. And Mark says that these kinds of remarks, I'm going to quote and then give a little bit of analysis of Mark's commentary. This speaks to the futility, to a sense of futility in the West when we ourselves join these kinds of conversations about Putin's demise. Blandishments and threats, overtures and sanctions all seem to have failed to influence Putin. As a result, the prospect of him not being here fuels daydreams about a deus ex machina resolution. It is hardly coincidental, I suspect, that these rumors really started to come thick and fast in 2014, the year when, as the West would frame it, Putin truly went rogue. These rumors then are driven by, and this is really what I quote Mark, I think it's a nice line, these rumors are driven by a mix of helplessness and hope, right? What I would call depoliticized emoting. And what Zelensky may not fully appreciate is that it can also justify inaction. As in, if Putin's going to be gone, we're going to be okay anyway if we don't do much. So I am actually less worried about that as a deleterious consequence for Zelensky. I don't think Zelensky going around saying that is going to dramatically tilt the West toward further inaction, actually. Although there is, of course, this sort of fantasy still very dominant in Western corridors of power about, oh, couldn't we just wave a magic wand and sort of go back to February 2022 as though nothing had ever happened. But I don't think it's going to make a significant difference. The real danger of this kind of talk for Zelensky is that it runs against Ukraine's capacity to frame an alternate picture of victory that captures a sustainable way for Ukraine to go on, over the next years as an independent state, as a sovereign state, and as a state with significant elements of democracy. And so being caught between a picture of victory as territorial liberation leading to regime collapse, which you've had to give up because reality has eaten it up, and not quite having yet a coherent alternate picture of a sustainable future. That kind of talk can play into a psychology of evasion, right? About framing a realistic and hopeful future for Ukraine in domestic discourse. So that might be a problem, right? There's no problem at all in principle with doing what Mr. Budanov did in 2022, talk about, made up things about Putin's imminent demise. Because if it's a form of state propaganda that helps Ukraine, great. The only problem with it is if it doesn't help Ukraine. Now, why is Zelensky doing this? Apart from the fact that he is surfing between a conception of victory that's gone and the conception of victory that's not yet been framed, and that's very difficult, and it's easy to insert these sorts of things into that gap about, external factors making things okay for us in a situation where it's not clear what levers are available to us to pull to make things okay. But I think the other psychology here that Zelensky has is that Zelensky is playing for time, and as he plays for time, this kind of discourse, he thinks, is reasonable to insert as a placeholder. Why is Zelensky playing for time? Well, he's playing for time because Trump wants to coerce Ukraine into, let's put it mildly, a borderline sustainable, borderline unsustainable resolution of the war for Ukraine. And playing for time means two things for Zelensky. A, maybe Europe will take more steps to galvanize itself, right, as a backer for Ukraine. So the more time we give, the further back we push Trump's desired resolution to the war, the better it'll be, number one. And number two, any kind of shake-up that occurs in the world might benefit Ukraine. If there is a shake-up in Moscow of the kind that Hamish is sort of gesturing towards rather blindly, or some kind of change in Washington, right? Let's say the Trump administration overreaches and begins to implode dramatically. Zelensky is absolutely conscious of that and hoping that playing for time may advantage him in this dimension. So these are some of the thoughts. These are some of the thoughts going on here. But fundamentally, the conversation we have had is really a conversation about quality of discourse and about not reducing ourselves to behaving like bots. Operating with actually sort of stock phrases that encourage an evasion of reality and probably in practice push away the prospect of the realization of our goals here, which are sort of dealing with our enemy here effectively, the Kremlin, and taking whatever is left of the global order or global disorder seriously, and taking Ukraine's security and Europe's security seriously. Let me know if this was helpful. Lots of love.